bullet wasn't meant for the little boy. Bryn Callahan knew that the moment she heard the shot, sharp, wrong, too close, and saw the child freeze in the middle of the parking lot, a paper bag of groceries clutched to his chest, eyes wide and locked on something behind her. She didn't think. That was the thing people always got wrong about moments like that. They assumed there was a decision. There wasn't. Her body just moved, the way it had always moved, toward whatever needed protecting. And then the pavement came up fast and the world went sideways and there was a burning just below her shoulder that felt, strangely, like being branded with a hot iron, rather than anything as dramatic as a bullet. She remembered the groceries hitting the ground, canned soup rolling, the boy's voice thin and high, "Lady, lady, wake up," and then nothing. Wren had been working the late shift at the pharmacy on Dundas West for 3 years. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't what she'd planned. At 29, she'd imagined herself somewhere else entirely. Maybe still in school. Maybe with a proper job that had benefits and a pension and a reason to wear something other than the blue polo shirt the company made all its staff wear. But her mother had gotten sick 2 winters ago, and then the bills had come, and then the part-time hours at the pharmacy had quietly become full-time, and the dream of finishing her nursing degree had moved itself to a shelf she stopped looking at. She didn't complain about it. That wasn't her way. She showed up. She filled prescriptions. She helped elderly customers read the small print on their medication bottles. And every second Friday she deposited her check and paid what she could toward her mother's home care costs, and told herself that things would turn around. Things had not turned around. But she had her mother, Elaine, and her mother had her, and that was enough. It was enough most days. The boy in the parking lot was 7, maybe 8. Dark hair, serious face, the kind of child who seemed older than he was. He'd come into the pharmacy twice that week already. The first time to buy a bottle of children's ibuprofen. The second time just to stand near the vitamin display, like he had nowhere else to be. She'd offered him a granola bar from her bag, the good kind, with chocolate chips, and he'd taken it solemnly and said, "Thank you," with the formality of a much older person. She didn't know his name. She'd meant to ask. On the night it happened, she was walking to her car. The parking lot behind the strip mall was badly lit and half empty, and she'd been thinking about whether her mother had remembered to take her evening medication and whether the leftover soup in the fridge was still good, when she heard the sound. She'd grown up in Sault Ste. Marie. She'd never heard a gunshot in real life before that night. She had thought for one absurd half-second that it was a car backfiring. Then she saw the boy. Then she moved. She woke up in a room that was not a hospital. Or rather, it had the smell of a hospital, the antiseptic quietness of one, the sense of being watched over by machines. But the ceiling above her was the wrong height. Too high. The kind of ceiling that belonged in old houses, the ones in Rosedale that people spent decades restoring. There were crown moldings. There was a chandelier, dim, casting amber light. She turned her head very carefully because her shoulder informed her immediately that turning too fast was not advisable. A man was sitting in a chair beside the bed. He was reading something, actual paper, a document of some kind, and he hadn't noticed that she was awake. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a little younger. Dark suit, no tie, sleeves rolled to the elbows, with the casual precision of someone who'd learned to look relaxed and hadn't quite achieved it. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd once been good-looking in a sharp, difficult way, and had since grown into something harder. There was a ring on her finger that she had never seen before in her life. Her left hand, 4th finger. A ring. Simple, white gold, unmistakable. "You're awake," the man said without looking up from his document. "There's a ring on my hand," Wren said. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He looked up then. His eyes were dark, and they held the particular expression of someone who is prepared for a difficult conversation and is now getting on with it. "Yes," he said. "I can explain that." "Please," she said. "Please explain that." His name, he told her, was Marcus Vane. She would have seen it in the news, possibly. He said this without arrogance, only as a statement of fact, in connection with certain business interests. He paused, as if waiting to see whether the name landed. It did not particularly land. She worked 60 hours a week and her news consumption was limited to what she caught on the radio during her commute. He seemed neither relieved nor disappointed by this. The boy in the parking lot, he said, was his son. His name was Oliver. He was 7 years old. Marcus Vane had been at the pharmacy. She hadn't seen him. He'd been in his car, when Oliver had slipped out of the vehicle to bring back the bag he'd left inside. The shot had been meant for Marcus. Oliver had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Wren had. He stopped. He looked at his document again, briefly, as if the words were there. "You kept my son alive," he said. She didn't know what to say to that. "The ring," she said instead. He set the document down. "There are people who want to harm my son to get to me." A threat was made, that night, before the situation could be contained. The most effective way to ensure your safety, and Oliver's continued safety, was to establish a connection between us that couldn't be easily severed. He said it carefully, like he'd rehearsed this too. A marriage record is a legal document. It provides you with protection under my name. It was a decision made while you were unconscious, and I understand if— Unconscionable, she said. Yes, he said. That. She stared at the ring. You married me, she said, while I was unconscious. My lawyers. While I was unconscious, I understand. I don't think you do, she said, with a steadiness that surprised even her, because if you did, you probably wouldn't have done it. Marcus Vane said nothing. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had not been spoken to that way in a very long time and was not sure, yet, what to do with it. The house was in Forest Hill. Of course it was. The kind of neighborhood where the trees were old enough to remember a different city, where the driveways were long enough to feel like a promise. She was told she could not leave. Not as a threat. He was careful about that, she noticed. He presented it more as a medical recommendation. Her shoulder, the blood loss, the recovery, and then as a security concern, the people who had fired the shot, who had not been located, and then quietly, as something else she couldn't quite name but felt the shape of an obligation. His, to her. The only way he knew how to discharge it was to keep her close. She called her mother from the phone they gave her. Elaine answered on the second ring. Wren, where are you? Mrs. Okafor said you didn't come home last night. I was going to call. I'm all right, Mum. She turned to face the window. The garden below was enormous and impeccably maintained. I had an accident. I'm staying somewhere for a few days while I recover. I'll explain everything soon, I promise. A pause. Her mother had learned over years to hear the things Wren didn't say. Are you safe? Wren looked at the ring. I think so. That's not a yes. It's the best I've got right now. She could hear her mother exhale slowly. All right. I'll feed myself. I know where the microwave is. Mum, go rest. Call me tomorrow. Oliver came to see her that afternoon. He knocked on the door of the room they'd given her, a guest room with a window seat and a view of the garden, and more pillows than she'd ever seen assembled in one place. She'd heard the knock and wasn't sure, at first, what it was, because the knock was just below the height she expected. She opened the door and he was standing there in sneakers and a blue hoodie, holding a drawing on a folded piece of paper. I made this for you, he said. She took it. When she unfolded it, it was a picture, crayon, neat for a 7-year-old, of a woman in a blue shirt standing in a parking lot. Above the woman, in large, uneven letters, thank you for saving my life. She sat down on the floor of the hallway, right there, because her legs suddenly felt very far away. Oliver sat down next to her, cross-legged, studying the drawing along with her. The trees look a bit wrong, he said, pointing to a smear of green in the corner. I ran out of the right green. I think they look great, she said. He looked at her sideways. He had his father's eyes, the same quality of paying attention, taking in more than he let on. Does your shoulder hurt a lot? A bit. Dad said you were very brave. She thought about that. I didn't really think about it, she said honestly. I just moved. Oliver considered this. That might be what brave is, he said, with the gravity of someone who had spent time on the question. Thinking about it later, but not before. She looked at him for a moment. Oliver, she said, the green looks exactly right. He smiled for the first time she'd seen, and it changed his whole face. The dinner was the part she hadn't been prepared for. She was told, the following evening, that there would be guests. Associates of Marcus Vane, she was given to understand. People for whom appearances were not merely social. They were information. They would draw conclusions from what they observed, and those conclusions had consequences. The woman who came to help her dress, Claire, quiet and efficient, who said nothing that wasn't necessary, brought a selection of clothes that fit Wren perfectly, which she found unsettling. Either someone had guessed her size, or someone had researched it. She didn't know which bothered her more. Marcus found her in the hallway outside the dining room 20 minutes before the guests arrived. He looked at her, and then looked away, which she'd noticed was something he did when he wasn't sure what he was about to say. I need to ask you something, he said. You've already married me, she said, without asking. I'm curious what category this request falls into. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but close. They'll expect to see a marriage, a real one. Tonight, in there, I need you to pretend, to be convincing. She looked at the closed dining room door. She could hear voices on the other side already. What happens if I'm not? She asked. Not defiantly, genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. These are not people who are kind to those they perceive as weak, he said. And they'll see you as weak if they think the marriage isn't real, which means they'll see Oliver as a better target than me. She thought of Oliver. The drawing, the wrong green. That might be what brave is. Fine, she said, but you should know that I'm doing this for him. Not for you. Marcus Vane looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. I wouldn't have expected otherwise. The dinner was 8 people around a table that could have fit 20. Crystal and white tablecloths and candles, the deliberate formality of men who had grown up with nothing and now used their abundance as a kind of armor. She recognized the type. Her mother had cleaned houses like this when Wren was small. A man named Sinclair Drake, heavy, silver-haired, with the steady eyes of someone who counted everything, sat across from her and asked, within the first 10 minutes, how she and Marcus had met. She set down her water glass. "A pharmacy, actually," she said. "He needed something for Oliver. I was working." She glanced at Marcus beside her, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. He came back the next day, and the day after that. I thought he was a hypochondriac. Light laughter around the table. Drake watched her. "You don't seem the type he usually," Drake began. "I'm not," she said pleasantly. "That's rather the point." Marcus reached under the table and found her hand. His was cold, or hers was cold, she wasn't sure. He didn't squeeze, he just held. She held back. It was the most honest thing that had happened between them since she'd woken up with his name. She had been there for 11 days when the second threat came. She didn't hear about it directly. She heard it the way she heard most things in that house. Through the particular silence that descended when Marcus ended a phone call, through the way Claire stopped making eye contact, through the sound of footsteps at hours when the house was usually quiet. Oliver knew something was wrong too. He came to find her that morning where she'd taken to sitting in the conservatory. It was the room that felt least like a museum, with plants that needed tending and windows that let in the grey October light, and he climbed into the armchair beside hers without being invited. "Is it bad?" he asked. She considered lying. She decided he deserved more than that. "I don't know yet," she said. "Your dad is handling it." "He handles everything," Oliver said, not admiringly, just as a fact. "He thinks if he handles everything himself, nobody has to worry. Does it work?" Oliver picked at a loose thread on the armchair arm. "I still worry," he said. "I just don't tell him." She looked at him. "Maybe you should." Oliver looked back at her. "Maybe you should tell him things too," he said, with the devastating precision that children sometimes achieved. "He doesn't know how to ask." She thought about that for a long time after Oliver wandered away to find breakfast. She found Marcus in his study that evening. She knocked. He said, "Come in," without looking up, and she came in and stood on the other side of his desk and waited until he did look up. "Oliver worries," she said. "He doesn't tell you because he doesn't want to add to what you're already carrying. But he worries constantly, and he thinks you don't notice, and it's making him feel very alone in this house." Marcus said nothing. The pen in his hand had stopped moving. "I'm not telling you this to criticize you," she said. "I'm telling you because I think you should know." He put the pen down. He looked at the desk for a moment. Then he said quietly, "He told you that, in the way children tell you things," she said. "The way they say everything except the thing, and you have to hear the thing underneath." Marcus leaned back in his chair. He looked tired, she thought, not in the obvious way, but in the way of someone who had been keeping something at bay for a very long time. "I don't always know how to be what he needs," he said. "I know how to keep him safe." "That's different." "Yes," she said, "it is." Silence. The study was lined with books. Red ones, she noticed. Spines creased, some with markers in them. She'd assumed they were decorative. She was revising that assumption. "Wren," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without the distance of a title or a formal address. "What do you need from this arrangement?" "What would make it?" He stopped. "I want to know what I owe you." She thought about it. Really thought. "My mother," she said. "She needs home care. She's been managing on too little for too long, and it's not sustainable, and I can't fix it on a pharmacy salary." She kept her voice steady. "That's what I need, and I want you to actually talk to your son." He looked at her for a long time. "The care for your mother," he said, "is already arranged, as of this week. I should have told you earlier." She blinked. He'd done it without her asking, without being asked. She wasn't sure what to do with that. "And Oliver," he said. "I'll do better. I'll try." He paused. "I don't always know the words." "He doesn't need the words," she said. "He needs you to sit in the room." She was there for 3 weeks before the threat was resolved. Dismantled as she understood it, though the details were deliberately withheld from her. The morning Marcus came to tell her she could leave if she wanted to. The October light was doing something specific to the conservatory, coming through the condensation on the glass in long flat bands that lay across the floor like something painted there. Oliver was watering the plants with her. He'd appointed himself her assistant 2 weeks ago and taken the role seriously. Marcus stood in the doorway. He looked at Oliver first in the way she'd noticed he'd started doing, really looking, staying a moment longer than he used to. "Oliver," he said. "Good morning." Oliver looked up. "You're up early. I wanted to catch you both." He looked at Wren then. "The situation has been resolved. You can go home." Oliver's hand stilled on the watering can. Wren watched him. "Right," she said carefully. "I'll need to call my mother, and there are a few things in the room, Wren." Oliver's voice was very quiet. She looked at him. He was looking at the plant in front of him, the small fern she'd been teaching him to identify by the shape of its fronds. His jaw was tight with the effort of not saying something. "Oliver," she said just as quietly. "What is it?" He set the watering can down. He looked up at her, and for a moment the 7-year-old was entirely visible under the serious exterior. Uncertain, hopeful, terrified of being wrong. "You don't have to go," he said. "If you didn't want to." She looked at him. Then she looked at Marcus, who was watching her with the same quality of stillness he'd had that very first night, sitting in the chair beside her bed, not quite knowing what she would do. She thought about her mother, taken care of. About the conservatory, the plants, the chair she'd claimed. About 11 days becoming 3 weeks, becoming something she hadn't expected. She thought about a drawing in crayon, a woman in a blue shirt, wrong green trees that were exactly right. "I'd need my own space," she said, looking at Marcus. "My own room, properly mine. And I need to keep working. I'll sort out the hours, but I'm not giving up the pharmacy." He nodded. "Whatever you need," she said. "Need to actually talk to your son, not just sit in rooms. Talk. I'm working on it. Work faster." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough that she filed it away. She picked up the watering can where Oliver had left it. "The fern needs the edges," she told Oliver, who was still looking at her with an expression she recognized. Her own, from every moment she'd talked herself into believing things would eventually be all right. "You always water the middle and miss the roots." He took the can back carefully. He began to water the edges. "Better," she said. Outside, the October light was doing that particular thing it did in Toronto in the fall, when the city had already made its peace with the cold, and the trees had gone every shade between amber and rust, and the morning felt, for a moment, like the beginning of something that hadn't had a name yet but would. She stayed.